You've done a spiritual practice before. Maybe something you found on your own, maybe something passed down to you, and at some point, you looked up from it and thought, am I actually connecting to anything here, or am I just going through motions that someone else designed? That question is exactly where this starts, because buried inside certain Gnostic texts that were nearly destroyed, that survived only because someone had the presence of mind to hide them in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert, there is a practice, a specific one, something the early Gnostic communities called the monad call. Not a prayer, not a meditation technique, something structurally different from both. And I tried it, for real, every night, for a sustained stretch of time. I tracked what happened, I sat with what didn't happen, and I came out the other side with a perspective that I genuinely did not expect. What shocked me wasn't a dramatic vision. It wasn't a voice from the beyond. What shocked me was subtler than that, and in some ways, far more unsettling, because it suggested that the entire architecture of how most people approach spiritual contact is built on an assumption that the Gnostics considered a category error. That's what this video is about. We're going to get into what the monad actually is, why the call is structurally different from prayer, and what happened when I actually did it. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Library. Let's establish the foundation first, because if you walk into the monad call without understanding what the monad is, you're just making sounds in a dark room. Most people, when they hear the word monad, either blank on it completely or reach for some vague philosophical memory. Leibniz maybe, or something from a freshman metaphysics class. That's not what we're talking about. In the Gnostic cosmological framework, the monad is not a concept, it's not a symbol. It is the originary source of all existence, not a being who created the universe from outside it, but the undivided, unbounded ground from which everything that exists first emanated. The Apocryphon of John, one of the central texts recovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, describes it this way. The monad is a monarchy with nothing above it, pure light which no eye can behold. Sit with that for a second. Not a deity, not a god in the conventional sense, not a personality seated on a throne, something prior to all of that, something that doesn't respond to worship because it doesn't occupy a position separate from you that could be worshipped. Here's the analogy that finally cracked this open for me. Imagine the ocean. Now imagine a wave, real, physical, with height and motion and power. The wave is not the ocean, but the wave is also not separate from the ocean. The wave is what the ocean does in that particular location at that particular moment. Remove the ocean, and there is no wave. But the wave is not a diminished version of the ocean. It is the ocean expressing itself locally. That is the Gnostic understanding of what you are. You are not a creature at a distance from the monad, petitioning it from the outside. You are a localized expression of it, a divine spark, what the Gnostics called the pneuma, that has become temporarily entangled in material existence and in the process has largely forgotten what it is. The trimorphic protonoia, another Nag Hammadi text that I personally find to be one of the most staggering pieces of ancient writing in existence, describes the first principle, the monad, as a voice that was present before the world was formed. The opening lines describe awareness itself as the first emanation of the divine, not matter, not energy, awareness. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant. If you are a localized expression of that awareness, and if awareness is itself the first emanation of the monad, then the relationship between you and the monad is not worshiper to God. It is not supplicant to authority. It is not small creature to infinite being. It is the relationship of a wave to the ocean. Recognition, not petition. And that single distinction is what the monad call is built on. But before we get to the mechanics of the call itself, we have to understand what it's being contrasted against, and why that contrast matters so much. Because the Gnostic teachers didn't just offer an alternative to conventional prayer. They argued that conventional prayer, as most people practice it, was pointing in the wrong direction entirely. Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, who wrote his famous treatise against the Gnostics around 180 CE, singled out precisely this teaching as dangerous. He wasn't wrong that it was threatening. He just had the wrong idea about who it was threatening. When an institution attacks a teaching not because it's false, but because it destabilizes the institution's role as mediator, that's when you need to pay attention. That's the tell. One viewer left a comment on my video, "I prayed to the monad every night for a week," that stopped me mid-scroll. They wrote, "It happened to me this year at 51. My mind is totally silent for the first time in my life since studying the monad." That's not the comment of someone who learned a fact. That's the comment of someone who encountered something that rearranged them from the inside. So, if the monad is the ground of all being, not a separate deity but the originary awareness from which everything emanates, then what exactly is wrong with prayer? I want to be precise here because this is the part that makes people uncomfortable, and I'd rather give you the actual argument than soften it into something easier to swallow. Conventional intercessory prayer, the kind practiced across most mainstream religious traditions, operates on a specific structural assumption that the divine is external to you, that it is higher than you, that you are in a condition of need or lack, and that the correct posture toward it is supplication. You bow, you petition, you ask, you wait. Now, if you are actually a wave in an ocean, that posture is not just ineffective, it is actively reinforcing the forgetting. Every time you externalize the divine and position yourself below it, you are practicing separation. You are rehearsing over and over the very amnesia the Gnostics said was the core problem of human existence. The demiurge, the lesser creator deity in Gnostic cosmology, wasn't some mustache-twirling villain. He was a being who had lost contact with the monad and, in that loss, constructed a material world built on the assumption of separation and hierarchy. Sound familiar? The liturgical structures of most institutional religions mirror exactly that architecture. Hierarchical clergy, mediated access to the divine, ritualized supplication. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening just saying, "That's my one editorial interjection, I'll move on." The Gnostics saw petitionary prayer not as connection, but as a mechanism that encoded the very distance it was supposed to be bridging. So, if prayer reinforces unconscious separation, what did the Gnostic tradition actually do instead? They pointed to the monad call. The distinction is structural. Where prayer emphasizes humility and unworthiness, the monad call emphasizes recognition and identity. Where prayer asks, the monad call declares. Where prayer says, "I am here, below you, in need," the monad call says, "I am this. I have always been this. I am remembering." You are not making a request. You are making an ontological claim about your fundamental nature. And when you make that claim with genuine interior recognition, not as a performance, not as wishful thinking, but as a statement you know to be true, something in the architecture of your experience begins to shift. Now, here's the part where I need to be honest about what the call actually involves, because there's a version of this idea floating around the internet that reduces it to an affirmation. Just say, "I am the monad" a few times and wait for enlightenment to arrive. That's not it. That's not gnosis. That's just a library card. The Gnostic texts that describe the monad call, particularly the longer sections of Pistis Sophia, a text dating to roughly the 3rd century CE, describe a practice of interior turning. Not a verbal formula, a reorientation of attention. The question isn't what am I aware of? The question is who is aware, not what thoughts are arising, not what sensations are present. Who is it that is noticing all of that? Turn your attention back on itself. Don't answer with a name or a history, just look. That looking, that act of awareness turning to examine itself, is what the Gnostic tradition pointed to as the primary gesture of the monad call. Because the monad, remember, is described in the Apocryphon of John as pure awareness, prior to form. When you turn attention back on its own source and find not a thought, not an image, not a sensation, but something that witnesses all three, you are touching the ground the Gnostics were pointing at. This is also why, by the way, the practice was considered dangerous by institutional authorities. You don't need a priest for this, you don't need a building, you don't need an approved intermediary of any kind. The access point is interior, it's available in every moment, and it doesn't require any external structure to facilitate it. So that's the what and the why. Now I want to tell you what actually happened when I tried it, because the experience didn't match what I expected, and I think that gap is important. I want to be precise about what happened, because the temptation when you're describing interior experience is to either over-dramatize it or sanitize it into something respectable. I'm going to do neither. I first encountered the monad call not through this channel's research process, but earlier, about 2 years before I started Gnostic Library. I had been working through a translation of the Nag Hammadi texts late one night, specifically the Apocryphon of John, and I hit the passage describing the monad as the immeasurable light, pure, holy, and immaculate. A light that is higher than perfection, because perfection implies a standard, and the monad precedes all standards. And something in me just stopped, not in a mystical way, in a very quiet, almost clinical way, like wait. If this is true, if awareness itself is the first thing that existed, not matter, not energy, but the capacity to know, then what am I actually? Not in a religious sense, in a structural sense. I tried the practice that night, informal, fumbling, without any real instruction. I just tried to turn attention back on itself the way the text seemed to be gesturing at. And I'll be honest, I mostly got thoughts about trying to turn attention back on itself, which is not the same thing. It took me weeks of returning to it before something shifted. And I want to be precise about what that shift was, because I'm not claiming supernatural experience for its own sake. I'm telling you what happened. The closest description I have is this. Most of the time, experience feels like it's happening in a container. Like there's a me located somewhere behind my eyes, inside my skull, and the world is arriving at that location from outside. Sense data coming in. That's the default architecture of ordinary experience. What happened? Gradually, not all at once, was that container quality began to dissolve. Not frightening, more like discovering that what I had assumed was a room was actually just the place I'd been standing the whole time, and the rest of it didn't have walls. Something shifted. Not externally, internally. Like the difference between a radio being tuned and a radio suddenly locking onto a frequency. Clear signal, no static. Now, more recently, and this is what this video's title is actually pointing at, I returned to the practice with more intentionality. After putting together my video, I raised my divine spark every night for a week, which a lot of you responded to. I wanted to run the monad call as its own structured experiment. Same framework, nightly practice, consistent tracking, honest reporting. The first 3 nights were quiet, not nothing, but not remarkable. The practice felt clean, turning attention back toward its source, resting in whatever that space was, not forcing anything. There was a consistency to it that felt different from earlier attempts, less grasping. Night 4 is where it changed. I was about 20 minutes into the practice when something I can only describe as a quality of recognition landed. Not a vision, not a voice, more like, and I know how this sounds, being recognized. As if whatever was at the ground of the practice turned its attention in the opposite direction, toward me, or rather toward itself as me. I sat with that for a long time afterward, and what came out of it wasn't a conclusion or a belief. It was more like a question that had been running in the background of my life for years, simply stopped running. The question of whether any of this is real, whether there's actually something to contact here, that question quietly closed. Not because it was answered, because the one asking it had been located. A viewer named, and this comment came in on my Pray to the Monad video, someone who wrote, "I commanded the monad to heal my great-grandson of a potential awful condition." That comment stayed with me, not because of the content of the request, but because of the posture in it. They didn't ask, they commanded. They wrote from a position of identity, not petition. Whether you read that as prayer or as the monad call depends entirely on the interior architecture behind the words. That's the distinction the Gnostics were pointing at. The words matter less than the self-understanding doing the speaking. And that leads directly to the practical mechanics, the actual structure of how to do this, which is where we're going next. So here's where it gets cosmically significant, and I mean that literally, not as a figure of speech. The monad call is not a formula. That's the first thing to understand, and it's probably the most counterintuitive part for people who come to this from a religious background, because religion loves formulas. It loves prescribed language, scripted liturgy, the comfort of saying the right words in the right order. And I get that. There's a reason ritual exists. But the Gnostic tradition is pointing at something categorically different from ritual performance. The monad call is a posture, an interior orientation. It's less about what you say and more about who is saying it, or more precisely, what that speaker believes itself to be. Here's the analogy that finally cracked it open for me. Imagine you're an actor who has been playing a character for so long that you've forgotten you were ever an actor. You walk through life as the character, responding to its fears, its needs, its sense of smallness. And then, one day, something cracks the illusion. Not completely, just enough. You get a glimpse of yourself on the other side of the performance. The question is, from that moment forward, does your next line come from the character or from the one who was always behind it? That's the monad call, speaking from the one who was always behind it. Now, the Gnostic texts give us specific structural guidance here, and this is where the research I've done over the past several months genuinely shifted my practice. The trimorphic protonoia, and I've talked about this text before because it keeps surfacing as one of the most practically oriented documents from the Nag Hammadi library, opens with the divine first principle speaking in the first person. I am the voice that appeared through my thought, not the voice appeals to a higher power. The voice announces itself. The divine speaks through identity declaration, not through supplication. The Apocryphon of John goes further. It describes the monad as something that cannot be diminished, cannot be petitioned, cannot be added to or subtracted from. It exists beyond the categories of need and fulfillment, which means, and stay with me here, that if you are genuinely of the monad, if the divine spark in you is literally the monad expressing itself through a particular form, then prayer directed outward to a distant monad is something of a category error, like a wave petitioning the ocean. The ocean didn't leave. It's still what the wave is made of. So what does the practical structure look like? 3 distinct moves. First, descent into silence. Not quieting the mind through effort, but recognizing the silence that's already present beneath the noise. The Gnostic texts consistently describe the monad as existing in a state of stillness. Immeasurable silence is the phrase used in the Apocryphon of John. The first move in the call is not to produce something, but to find what was already there. Most people skip this step because it's uncomfortable. The noise feels like us. The silence feels unfamiliar. But the silence is where the call has any actual grounding. Second, identity declaration. This is the part that sounds strange out of context and makes complete sense once the cosmology is clear. You are not making a wish. You are not formulating a request. You are making a statement of what you are. I am a divine spark of the monad. The texts support this framing explicitly. The Pistis Sophia describes the soul's capacity to speak from its divine origin, to invoke the monad not as a foreign entity, but as one's own deepest nature recognizing itself. The statement is not affirmation in the self-help sense, it's ontological assertion. You're not trying to convince yourself of something. You're refusing to pretend you're less than what you are. Third, release without need. This is the one most people find hardest. After the declaration, you let it land without grasping for a result. Not because results don't matter. The Gnostic tradition was deeply practical about the liberation of the divine spark from material entrapment. But because grasping for results is the petitionary reflex reasserting itself. The moment you need something to happen, you've slipped back into the architecture of supplication. The monad call ends in a kind of resting, not a waiting. The difference is subtle, but absolutely critical. I want to be precise about what happened when I started working with this structure deliberately. I'm not claiming supernatural experience for its own sake. What I noticed, and this took about a week of consistent practice, was not a dramatic shift. It was a qualitative one. The interior posture during the call felt different from prayer in a way I had to keep checking was real. There was no weight of hope in it, no anxiety about whether it was working. That absence was itself the signal. Something in the architecture had changed. I've been sitting with how to talk about this final section for a while, because the territory it covers is the part that's easiest to dismiss and hardest to articulate without sounding like you've wandered off into wishful thinking. So let me be direct about what I'm actually claiming and what I'm not. I'm not claiming the monad call is magic. I'm not claiming it bypasses the material world or produces measurable supernatural outcomes on demand. What I am claiming, and I think the textual tradition supports this completely, is that it changes the interior structure of the one doing it. And if the Gnostic cosmology is right about what we are, that interior change is the most consequential shift available to a human being inside this particular configuration of reality. Here's why. The Gnostic diagnosis is specific. The condition of ordinary human consciousness is one of forgetting. The divine spark, trapped inside matter and the architecture of the demiurge's world, has lost its orientation toward the pleroma, toward the fullness of the divine realm it originally came from. That forgetting is not a moral failure. It's a structural condition. You didn't sin your way into it. You were born into a system specifically designed, in the Gnostic reading, to produce and maintain that amnesia. The monad call is the counter-technique to the amnesia. It is the specific practice of remembering what you are in a world built to make you forget it. Now, I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Library, and I'll tell you what I personally think is the most significant aspect of all of this, because it's something I haven't said directly in previous videos. I personally think the reason the Gnostic communities were so aggressively targeted, not just theologically disputed, but physically dismantled, their texts burned, their teachers killed or exiled, is specifically because this teaching dissolves the dependency that makes institutional religious authority function. You cannot control someone who has interiorized their own divine origin. You can threaten the body. You cannot threaten the spark. And an institution whose entire architecture depends on being the mediator between humans and the divine has an existential problem the moment people start doing what the monad call teaches. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening. Just saying. That's my one editorial interjection. I'll move on. But this is also why the historical suppression matters as evidence rather than just as background context. When Irenaeus of Lyon wrote his treatise against Gnostic teachings around 180 CE, he wasn't primarily making a philosophical argument. He was issuing a threat assessment. The Valentinian communities, the Scythian groups, the teachers who circulated texts like the Gospel of Philip, they represented a form of spiritual practice that was structurally incompatible with institutional control. When an institution attacks a teaching not because it's intellectually weak, but because it's threatening, that's worth paying attention to. A viewer named Marcus left a comment on my Demiurge video that I keep returning to. He wrote, and I'm quoting this directly because it articulates something precisely, "If the real God lies within us, so does the Demiurge. We are the architects of our own archons." That's not a small observation. That's someone who has understood the full internal map. The monad call doesn't just activate the divine spark. Practiced with clarity and honesty, it also illuminates the places where the demiurgic reflex is still running, the patterns of smallness, submission, and self-diminishment that aren't coming from outside you. They're coming from the internalized architecture of a world that taught you to be small. The call, done correctly, makes those patterns visible. Not comfortable, visible. And that's what happened in the week I described. The week I spent working with the three-part structure deliberately. What shifted was not just the posture during the call itself. It was the quality of self-observation afterward. Things I had been navigating unconsciously. Reflexive deference, the habit of framing my own understanding as probably wrong, the low-level hum of spiritual inadequacy, started becoming visible as patterns rather than just as the texture of normal experience. That's the diagnostic function of the call that the texts point at, but rarely spell out directly. Gnosis is not a state you achieve and then hold. It's a direction you keep facing. The monad call is the practice of continuously reorienting toward that direction against the gravitational pull of a world designed to point you away from it. Stop petitioning. Start recognizing. You were not made to call out to the divine from a distance, hoping it hears you across the gap. You were made to be the divine, catching a glimpse of itself through your particular set of eyes, in this particular arrangement of matter, at this particular moment in time. The call isn't a transmission you send outward. It's a signal you stop suppressing. If this video resonated with you, let me know by commenting, "I understood it."